The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the great hall, seeping through the thin soles of her worn leather slippers. It crept into the marrow of her bones, a familiar ache that harmonized with the sharper, more specific pain in her left leg. Alara shifted her weight, a subtle, practiced movement that did little to ease the throb. To anyone watching, she was just another Omega, a shadow flitting along the edges of the mating feast, her tray of half-empty goblets the only reason for her existence. To herself, she was a collection of pains, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the burning protest of the muscles in her good leg, and the deep old agony in her bad one, the one her father had broken, the one that had never healed right, the one that had defined her, branded her, and condemned her to this life of invisibility. Alpha Borin, her father, sat at the high table, his laughter a booming, cruel sound that scraped against her nerves. He hadn't looked at her once tonight. He never did. It was easier to pretend the crippled, useless daughter he'd sired didn't exist. She was a stain on his reputation, a flaw in his bloodline. Her mother had died birthing her, a final act of failure in his eyes. Alara was the living embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. Tonight was worse than usual. The hall was suffocatingly crowded, packed with the hopeful, the preening, and the powerful. Every unmated she-wolf from the Stone River Pack and its allies was present, their scents a cloying perfume of desperation and ambition. They were here for him, the Alpha King, Kalen, the Frost King of the North. He sat beside her father, a figure carved from glacier and shadow. He hadn't spoken a word in the hour she'd been serving, hadn't touched his food or wine. He simply watched, his eyes the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, sweeping over the room with a dispassionate intensity that made her shiver for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. He was ancient, they whispered, powerful beyond measure. His lands were a fortress of ice and snow, his heart just as frozen. He had ruled for 500 years without a mate, without a queen. Why he was here now, at a common mating feast, was a mystery that fueled the frantic whispers in the hall. An alliance, some said. A prophecy, others murmured. Alara didn't care about the reason. She just wanted the night to be over. Her leg was on fire, a sharp, stabbing pain that radiated from her hip to her ankle. The noise of the hall, the roaring fires, the drunken laughter. It was all blurring into a meaningless roar. Her vision swam. The heavy silver tray in her hands felt like it was made of lead. She took another step, her focus narrowed to the kitchens, a sanctuary of relative quiet. Just get to the door. Just a few more feet. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. The sense of roasted meat and spilled wine turned sour in her throat. Her bad leg, the one that had carried her through a lifetime of servitude, finally gave out. There was no cry, no sound of surprise, just a silent, dizzying fall. The tray slipped from her numb fingers, the goblets clattering against the stone with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden ringing silence that fell over the hall. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, for the familiar, jarring pain of her body hitting the unyielding floor, but it never came. Instead of cold stone, she was caught. Two arms, strong as ancient trees, wrapped around her. They were firm, unyielding, and impossibly, shockingly cold. The cold wasn't like the chill of the castle. It was a deep, penetrating frost, a cold that felt alive. It stole the air from her lungs. She blinked, her vision clearing. She was looking up into the face of the Alpha King. His ice-blue eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time, they held something other than detached appraisal. It was confusion, an earthquake of it, as if the ground he'd stood on for centuries had just crumbled beneath his feet. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every eye was on them, on the mighty Frost King holding a crippled Omega servant in his arms. He had moved faster than anyone could see, crossing the length of the high table to catch her before she hit the ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. This was a mistake, a terrible, public mistake. He would drop her. He would be disgusted. Her father's rage would be a thing of legend. But he didn't drop her. He held her as if she weighed nothing, his grip secure. His scent filled her senses, pine needles after a frost, clean, sharp winter air, and something else. Something ancient and lonely like the heart of a mountain. Alpha Born was on his feet, his face a mask of purple fury. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his voice tight with rage and humiliation. "Forgive this worthless creature. She is nothing. A clumsy servant." Kalen didn't look at him. His gaze remained locked on Alara's. He saw the tremor in her limbs, the terror in her wide gray eyes. He saw the faint silvery scar that traced the line of her jaw. He saw the exhausted resilience that clung to her like a second skin. He saw her. Slowly, as if speaking a language he was only just learning, he spoke. His voice was not the thunder of a king, but a low, quiet rumble, deep as a winter night. It cut through the silence, reaching every corner of the hall. "I'll take this one." The words were simple, declarative, and they shattered the world. The journey to the northern citadel was a blur. Alara was bundled in furs she'd only ever seen on nobles, and placed in a carriage that smelled of leather and cedar. The Alpha King rode on horseback alongside, a silent, imposing figure against the darkening sky. No one spoke to her. No one had dared to, not after Kalen had frozen one of her father's guards solid for attempting to pull her away from him. The man was still a statue of ice in the great hall, a testament to the king's displeasure. Her father's face, contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful, was the last thing she'd seen as they departed. That image was burned into her mind. He had not been angry that his daughter was chosen. He was enraged that his shame had been given a crown. They traveled for days, climbing higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and sharp, and the world turned to shades of white and gray. The citadel appeared as if by magic, carved from the peak of the highest mountain, its towers piercing the clouds like shards of ice. It was beautiful in the way a glacier was beautiful, vast, merciless, and utterly indifferent to the lives of mortals. The cold inside the castle was a living thing. It shimmered in the air, coated the stone walls in a permanent layer of frost, and stole the warmth from her body with a greedy hunger. The guards who met them at the gate had skin pale as snow and eyes the color of ice. They moved with a silent, lethal grace, their gazes sliding over her with mild curiosity before dismissing her. Kalen led her through echoing halls, his footsteps silent on the frozen floors. He brought her to a suite of rooms that were, astonishingly, warm. A massive fireplace crackled with a roaring blaze, thick furs covered the floor, and the bed was piled high with woolen blankets. The warmth was so sudden, so absolute, that it made her dizzy. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the castle, an island of life in an ocean of ice. He stood in the doorway, a sentinel of frost guarding her small pocket of heat. He hadn't touched her since the feast, hadn't spoken more than a handful of commands to his men. Now he finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This is your domain," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You will not be disturbed. You will have anything you require." Alara clutched the fur cloak tighter around her small frame. Her leg ached from the journey, a dull, insistent pulse. "Why?" The word was a whisper, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Why me?" His gaze was heavy, ancient. "The moon goddess has her reasons. It is not our place to question them. It was a dismissal, a king's answer that was no answer at all. But I am broken, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She hated the word, but it was the truth she had been fed her entire life. She forced herself to meet his eyes. I cannot run. I cannot hunt. I cannot give you strong pups. Your people will not accept me. A flicker of something, pain, anger, something she couldn't name, passed through his eyes. My people will accept whom I command them to accept. He took a step into the room, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. He stopped well away from the fire, as if its heat were poison. This is an arrangement, nothing more. A political necessity. I require a mate to secure my bloodline and the northern alliances. The goddess chose you. The matter is concluded. He turned to leave, his dark cloak swirling around him. There will be no bond, he added, his back to her. No intimacy. You will be queen in name. You will have safety, comfort, respect. In return, you will exist. That is all I ask. The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut, locking her into this gilded cage. He was offering her everything she'd never had: safety, warmth, food, but on his terms. Terms that built a wall of ice between them as real as the ones that formed the castle. He left, and she was alone with the fire and the silence. She sank onto the edge of the plush bed, the softness a foreign concept. He wanted her to exist. For her entire life, that was all she had ever done. She had existed in the shadows, in the cold, in the pain. Now she would exist in a warm room, a queen of nothing, mated to a king of ice who refused to feel. It was a better prison, but it was a prison all the same. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Ilara kept to her rooms as instructed. Servants, silent women with the same pale skin and winter-colored eyes as the guards, brought her food, new clothes, anything she asked for. They were polite, but distant. She was an anomaly, a strange crippled bird from the south who now lived in the heart of their frozen kingdom. She could feel their questioning stares when they thought she wasn't looking. Kalen did not summon her. He did not visit. For the first week she saw him only from her balcony, a solitary figure walking the ramparts of the castle, a storm of snow seeming to follow in his wake even on clear days. He never looked up. Loneliness was an old, familiar cloak, but here it felt different. It was sharper, colder. In her old pack she had been invisible amidst a crowd. Here her solitude was absolute. She began to talk to the fire, its warmth her only companion. She would trace the patterns in the furs on the floor, her fingers sinking into their softness. She ate every meal, slowly, savoring the taste of food that wasn't scraps. The dull ache in her leg began to recede, replaced by a strength she hadn't felt in years. One night she was jolted from a light sleep by a presence. She sat up, her heart pounding. Kalen was standing in the shadows of her room, near the door. He was perfectly still, a statue of darkness. He hadn't made a sound. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. He didn't respond for a long moment. He was just watching her. His eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light from the dying embers in the hearth. The cold emanating from him was a physical force, pushing back against the warmth of the room. "You do not scream," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. "Should I?" she asked, her fear giving way to a strange sort of calm. "Most do," he stated, as if it were a simple fact. "When they wake to find me in their chambers. You are my king, and my mate," she said, the word feeling clumsy and untrue on her tongue. "Why would I scream?" He seemed to consider this. He took a half step forward, and she saw the fine layer of frost that clung to the edges of his black tunic. His breath plumed in the air, even in the heated room. "You are not like the others." "The others?" "The women my council has presented over the centuries. They look at me and see power. A crown. A throne." He paused. "They do not see the man." "And what do I see?" she asked, genuinely curious. His gaze was intense, searching. "I do not know. That is the question that brings me here." He came every night after that. He never approached her bed, never came too close to the fire. He would stand in the shadows and they would talk. At first, it was stilted. She would ask about the castle, about the north. He would give short, clipped answers. But she was persistent in her quiet way. She told him about her life in the Stone River Pack, not as a plea for pity, but as a simple recounting of facts. She spoke of the cold stone floors, the constant hunger, the way the other Omegas would share their meager rations with her when the Alphas weren't looking. She spoke of the pain in her leg as an old acquaintance. He, in turn, began to speak of his own prison. He told her of the cold. He called it his curse, a consequence of his immense power. It had crept into him centuries ago, a slow-acting poison, freezing him from the inside out. He hadn't felt true warmth in 500 years. The heat of a fire was painful to him. The touch of another person was an agony of burning cold. "That is why you chose this arrangement," she realized one night, the pieces clicking into place. "A queen in name only, because you cannot touch." "I cannot," he confirmed, his voice flat. "Any warmth is a shock to my system. It accelerates the frost. The curse feeds on the contrast." A profound sadness washed over her. He was the most powerful being she had ever met, feared by all, and he was utterly, completely alone in his fortress of ice, unable to experience the simplest of comforts. One evening, while mending a tear in one of her new tunics, she pricked her finger. A single drop of crimson blood welled up. Kalen, standing in his usual spot, went rigid. His eyes, fixed on the drop of blood, flared with a pale blue light. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed. "Your blood," he breathed, his voice tight. "It is warm. I can feel its heat even from here." An idea, bold and terrifying, took root in her mind. She stood up, her needlework falling to the floor. She walked towards him, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her limp was more pronounced when she was nervous. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice a low growl. It was the first time he had ever used a tone of command with her. He took a step back, melting deeper into the shadows. She stopped, several feet away. She could feel the aura of intense cold rolling off him in waves. It made the hairs on her arms stand up. "You are in pain," she said softly. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the tightness around his mouth. The curse was a constant torment. "It is my burden to bear," he said stiffly. "You bear it alone," she countered. She looked at her finger, at the small, healing pinprick. "You said the goddess chose me? Why?" "I told you." "No," she interrupted, a flicker of her old resilience sparking to life. "You told me the official reason, the political one, but you came to the feast yourself. You, who have not left this kingdom in a century. You were looking for something." She took another hesitant step. "What did you see when you looked at me?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire behind her and the faint, almost inaudible whisper of ice crystals forming in the air around him. "I saw a flame," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "In a world of embers, I saw a tiny, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. The seer told me to look for it, a spark of warmth that could hold back the winter." Her breath caught in her throat. A flame. He had looked at her, the broken, worthless Omega, and seen a fire. "I don't understand," she said. "I have no power. No magic." "Neither do I anymore," he said, and the admission was raw, torn from him. "The hope was a fool's errand. The frost is winning, Ilara. It is always winning." The boundary between them, the carefully constructed arrangement, was melting away, eroded not by passion, but by shared vulnerability. He was a king with no hope, and she was an Omega with a flicker of fire she didn't know she possessed. And in that cold, quiet room, a fragile, impossible connection began to form. He had started visiting her out of duty, or curiosity. Now, she realized, he was coming because her presence, the simple ambient warmth of her body and her spirit, was the only relief he had from the endless cold. It was a comfort he couldn't touch, but one he was becoming desperate for. And she, who had never been wanted, was starting to feel the first terrifying shoots of something she could only name as hope. The fragile peace of their nightly conversations was shattered by the arrival of a delegation from the south. Ilara watched from her balcony as the banners of the Stone River Pack, a snarling gray wolf on a field of brown, were carried into the citadel's courtyard. Her blood ran cold. Her father was here. Kaelin had forbidden her from the throne room, a command delivered by a grim-faced guard. "The king's orders. You are to remain in your chambers for your own safety." But she couldn't. A gnawing dread coiled in her gut. She had to know. She slipped out of her rooms, her limp seeming to mock her as she hurried down the frozen corridors. She knew a side passage, one a servant girl had shown her, that led to a gallery overlooking the great hall. Hidden in the shadows, she watched the scene unfold below. Her father, Alpha Borin, stood before the frozen throne, flanked by two of his most brutal enforcers. He looked smaller here, diminished by the cavernous, ice-sheathed hall and the imposing figure of Kaelin seated on the throne. But his voice was just as loud, just as full of arrogant fury. "This is an insult," Borin roared, his voice echoing off the ice-encrusted walls. "You come to my lands, to my feast, and you choose that. A cripple. A worthless half-wolf who brings shame to my name. The alliance is void. She is not a suitable mate for any alpha, let alone the King of the North." Kaelin was terrifyingly still. The temperature in the hall, already frigid, plummeted. Frost began to creep up the pillars, thick and white. "You are addressing my future queen," Kaelin said, his voice deceptively soft, yet it carried more menace than her father's bellow. "Choose your next words with the care of a man who wishes to see another sunrise." Borin, blinded by his own rage, didn't heed the warning. "Queen? That thing? She is a curse. Her mother died bearing her. She has brought nothing but misfortune. I did what I had to do to teach her her place, to temper her pathetic spirit." "You did what?" Kaelin's voice was now dangerously quiet. A cruel, proud smile twisted Borin's lips. "I broke her. Her leg. When she was just a pup. She had a defiance in her eyes I could not stomach. I took a stone and I corrected her. I made her what she is. A broken thing fit only for scrubbing floors." Ilara clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Hearing him say it, so proudly, so casually, was like feeling the stone break her bone all over again. The memory, sharp and blindingly painful, tore through her. The snap of bone, her own childish scream, his face above her, devoid of pity. Down below, Kaelin rose from his throne. He didn't storm forward. He descended the icy steps with a slow, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any outburst. A blizzard was gathering in the hall, a storm of pure, undiluted rage swirling around the king. The air crackled. His eyes glowed with a terrifying, pale light. "You dare," Kaelin whispered, the words smoking in the frigid air. "You dare come into my home and boast of torturing a child? Of torturing her?" Bourne finally seemed to realize his mistake. Fear flickered in his eyes. She is my blood. I had the right. You have no rights here, Kalen hissed. He raised a hand, his fingers unnaturally pale. You are less than the dirt beneath her feet. You will leave my lands now. The alliance is not void, it is forfeit. Your pack will receive no aid, no trade, no sanctuary from the north. You will be isolated. And if you ever speak her name again, I will march south and turn your pathetic river into a sheet of glass. He lowered his hand, and the blizzard receded, though the bone-deep chill remained. Go, before I forget the mercy my future queen has taught me. Boren, his face pale with a mixture of fury and terror, stumbled back. He and his guards turned and fled the hall, their bravado shattered. Alara remained in the gallery, trembling. She had never seen anyone stand up for her. Never. The fierce, absolute protection Kalen had just shown, it cracked something open in her chest, something warm and painful. But her relief was short-lived. As the great doors boomed shut behind her father, Kalen staggered. He gripped the arm of his throne, his knuckles white. A tremor ran through his massive frame. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, and the sound was one of pure agony. The surge of power, the unbridled rage he had unleashed to defend her, had come at a terrible cost. The curse, which he had held in a delicate balance for centuries, was now raging out of control. The frost on the walls thickened, racing towards him. The ice on his throne climbed his arm, encasing it in a glittering sheath. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the hall as if searching for something. For her. His eyes met hers across the distance, and in them, she saw not the fury of a king, but the desperate plea of a dying man. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, a fallen king on a throne of his own making. The frost, now unchecked, swarmed over him, consuming him. The castle itself seemed to groan in agony. The ever-present chill deepened into a life-stealing cold that penetrated stone and bone. The guards and healers who rushed into the throne room were thrown back by a wave of pure frost. Kalen lay at the foot of his throne, no longer a man, but a figure of ice, his skin turning a translucent, terrifying blue. "The king is lost!" someone cried out. "The frost has taken him!" Panic erupted. Advisors shouted orders. Guards scrambled to secure the citadel, and the healers stood by helplessly, their magic useless against a power so primal. One of the senior advisors, a grim-faced man named Lord Valerius, found Alara as she stumbled down from the gallery, her legs screaming in protest. "You must leave, my lady," he said, his voice urgent but not unkind. "There is nothing to be done. The castle is no longer safe. The king's life force is what held the worst of the cold at bay. Now, it will consume everything." Alara stared past him at the frozen figure on the floor. Kalen, the man who saw a flame in her. The king who had defended her honor against the man who had broken her. Leave him? The thought was a physical violation. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not leaving him." She pushed past the stunned advisor and walked, limped, towards the throne. The cold was a solid wall, pushing against her, stealing her breath. It was a pain beyond anything she had ever felt, a cold that burned and bit and sought to freeze the very blood in her veins. The guards tried to stop her, but she slipped past their grasp. She reached him. He was encased in a thick layer of crystalline ice, only the faint outline of his face visible beneath it. There was no sign of breath, no movement. He was gone. The world seemed to tilt, a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown her. This was her fault. His rage on her behalf had cost him his life. "No," she whispered, sinking to her knees beside him. The cold of the floor was so intense it felt like fire. Tears streamed down her face, freezing into tiny crystals on her cheeks. "No, you don't get to do this." She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the ice, covering his chest. The cold was shocking, a jolt that went straight to her heart. It felt like touching death itself. But she didn't pull back. She pressed her hand harder, pouring all her will, all her grief, all the fragile, budding love she felt for this impossible man into that single point of contact. Days blurred into a single long night of vigil. The throne room was abandoned save for her. Valerius had tried to remove her by force, but a strange energy had pulsed from her, pushing him back. He had looked at her with a new, startled expression and ordered the room sealed, leaving her to her hopeless task. She did not eat or sleep. She knelt by Kaelin's frozen form, one hand resting on his icy chest, the other gripping his frozen fingers. She talked to him, her voice a low, hoarse whisper in the tomb-like silence. She told him everything, about the loneliness, about the whispers and the jeers, about the small secret kindness of a kitchen maid who would sneak her a warm piece of bread. She told him how it felt when he'd caught her at the feast, how for the first time in her life she hadn't felt invisible. She hadn't felt broken. She had just felt seen. "You saw a flame," she whispered, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "But you were wrong. It was you. You were the one who lit it." She poured out her heart, confessing the love that had grown in the quiet darkness of her chambers, a love for the lonely, broken man beneath the crown of ice. She knew it was hopeless. She knew he was gone, but she couldn't stop. It was the only thing she had left to give. "I love you, Kaelin," she choked out, pressing her forehead against the ice on his chest. "So you can't leave me. You are not allowed to leave me alone again." The bond between them, the one he had denied and she had barely understood, flared in that moment. It was no longer a faint theoretical connection. It was a conduit, a channel for her raw, desperate emotion. Her grief, her rage, her absolute defiant love poured through it, a torrent of feeling crashing against the wall of ice that held him captive. She felt a shift, a deep seismic tremor not in the castle, but inside herself. A warmth sparked in the center of her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before. It wasn't the pleasant heat of a fire. It was something wilder, more primal. It was a wellspring of power she never knew she possessed. The king's words echoed in her mind. "I saw a flame." The spark grew, fueled by her desperate refusal to let him go. It was a tiny sun igniting within her, a force of pure life and heat rising to meet the absolute cold. Her self-doubt, the voice of her father telling her she was worthless and broken, tried to smother it. But her love for Kaelin was stronger. Her defiance was stronger. "No," she said again, but this time the word was not a whisper of grief. It was a command, a word of power. "You will not die." The warmth erupted. It surged from her chest, down her arms and into her hands. It was not fire, not a destructive force. It was pure, molten heat, a wave of life-giving energy that was the absolute antithesis of his curse. The ice encasing Kaelin sizzled where she touched it. Steam hissed into the air. The thick, crystalline shell began to crack, fractures spreading out from her hands like lightning. The light that poured from her was golden, brilliant, filling the dark, frozen throne room with the radiance of a sunrise. She felt no pain, only a profound sense of purpose, of rightness. This was who she was, not the broken Omega, not the worthless cripple. She was this warmth, this fire. With a sound like a mountain breaking apart, the ice shattered. It didn't melt. It sublimated, turning directly into a vast cloud of steam that billowed to the ceiling. The wave of heat from her body washed over Kaelin, sinking into his frozen tissues, chasing the ancient frost from his very cells. The bluish, translucent color of his skin receded, replaced by the pale tone of a living man. Color flooded back into his lips. The ice in his hair melted, dripping onto the stone floor. She felt his heart, a single, shuddering beat. Then another, and another. A slow, steady rhythm picking up speed. He gasped, a deep, ragged intake of air that was loud in the sudden silence. His eyes, which had been frozen open, snapped shut, and then opened again. They were no longer the pale, icy blue of a winter sky. They were a clear, deep gray like stone after a warm rain. They were full of shock and pain and a raw, staggering wonder. He stared at her, at the golden light that was still pouring from her, bathing them both in its warmth. He lifted a hand slowly, as if he didn't trust his own limbs. He reached for her face. She flinched, expecting the familiar biting cold of his touch. But his fingers were warm. The contact was a lightning strike, warm skin against warm skin. For her, it was a simple, gentle caress. For him, it was the first sensation of warmth he had felt from another living being in 500 years. An expression of such profound, heart-shattering relief broke over his face that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Elara," he breathed, his voice rough, unused. It was the first time he had said her name. The light receded, sinking back into her, leaving her feeling drained but whole, as if a part of her she never knew was missing had finally clicked into place. She swayed, the exhaustion of the past few days hitting her all at once. He moved, his limbs still stiff but functional. He pushed himself up and gathered her into his arms, pulling her from the cold floor and onto his lap. His embrace was not the careful, distant hold of before. It was desperate, tight, as if he was afraid she might fade away. His body, no longer a source of chilling frost, was a furnace of newfound warmth. "I felt you," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I was gone, adrift in an endless winter, and I heard you. I felt your warmth. You called me home." She leaned against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The deep, old ache in her leg was gone. She looked down, flexing her foot. The pain, the constant companion of her entire life, had vanished, burned away by the power that had saved him. She was no longer broken. "I wasn't going to let you go," she whispered, her voice muffled against his tunic. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his large hands framing her face. His gray eyes were clear, and for the first time, she could see the soul within them, ancient and weary, but now filled with a light that mirrored her own. "My flame," he said, his voice full of awe. "My stubborn, beautiful flame." He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of reverence. It was a thank you, a promise. It was the meeting of winter and summer, the fusion of two halves of a whole that had been searching for each other for centuries. "I love you," he said against her lips, the words not a curse, but a vow. "I am saying that I love you, and it's going to save me." She finally, truly believed it. She was not a mistake. She was not a curse. She was a queen, and she was home. Spring came to the northern lands. It was not a slow, gentle thaw, but a sudden, riotous explosion of life. The centuries of unnatural winter receded in a matter of weeks. The snow melted from the mountains, revealing green slopes and ancient forests. Rivers that had been frozen solid for generations broke free, their rushing water a song of rebirth. For the first time in living memory, flowers bloomed in the citadel's courtyards. The castle itself was transformed. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a comfortable coolness. The sheaths of ice fell from the walls, revealing intricate stonework and tapestries that hadn't been seen for centuries. The citadel was no longer a fortress of ice, but a true home, filled with the sounds of laughter and the warmth of the sun streaming through newly cleared windows. Elara, their fire queen, was the heart of that transformation. Her power now awakened, settled within her, a constant, gentle warmth that had healed her old injury completely. She walked the halls without a limp, her step confident and sure. The people of the North, who had at first been suspicious of the Southern Omega, now revered her. They had witnessed the miracle. They saw the life she had brought back to their king and their lands. They saw her not as a cripple who had been cured, but as a queen who had finally come into her power. Kaelin was a different man. The Frost King was a memory. In his place was a king who smiled, who laughed, whose touch was warm and reassuring. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the ancient pain in his eyes replaced by a deep, abiding love whenever he looked at Alara. He ruled with the same strength and wisdom, but it was now tempered with a compassion that had been frozen for far too long. They dealt with her father's pact not with war, but with a new decree. Kaelin sent emissaries south, not with threats, but with an offer. An alliance based on mutual respect, and a new law to be enforced throughout the northern territories and their allies, that the strength of a wolf was measured not by their body, but by their heart. Omegas were to be protected, the weak were to be cared for, and any alpha who ruled through cruelty and fear, as Boren had, would face the combined wrath of the North. Boren was overthrown by his own pack within a month. They had seen the weakness behind his bluster and chose a new alpha, one who eagerly accepted the terms of the new alliance. Alara felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of justice. Her past no longer had any power over her. Her days were filled with a peace she had never imagined possible. She spent her mornings with Kaelin in the council chambers, her quiet insights proving as valuable as his centuries of experience. In the afternoons, they would walk the newly thawed grounds of the citadel, his hand always in hers, their warmth a shared, constant comfort. One evening, they stood on the balcony of her old rooms, the place where he used to watch her from the shadows. The air was soft, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Below, the courtyard was filled with children, the first generation who would grow up without knowing the biting, endless winter. Kaelin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. His warmth enveloped her, a familiar, welcome shield against the evening chill. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The power, the frost." He was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. "I miss the strength," he admitted. But it was a hollow strength, a power born of pain and loneliness. "It was a cage, Alara. I just didn't know it until you showed me the key." He turned her in his arms, his gray eyes searching her face. "What I have now," he said, his voice low and full of an emotion that still humbled her, "is better. This warmth, this life, you. It is all worth more than all the power in the world." She leaned up and kissed him, a soft press of lips that spoke of love and gratitude, and a future that was no longer a fearful thing to be endured, but a beautiful thing to be built together. He had saved her from a life of cold and pain, and she had saved him from an eternity of the same. They were not a king and his servant, not a savior and the saved. They were two halves of a single soul, a perfect balance of fire and ice, finally made whole. Standing on that balcony, with the promise of 1,000 more sunsets before them, Alara knew she was no longer the girl who had collapsed at the feast. She was the queen who had risen from the ashes, and her new world was just beginning.